thank you again for joining us today. This is Rob Love with Love & Company, and we have what's going to be the first of a two-part series, which we'll talk about just a little bit more as we get into this. But today's focus is on immediate strategies that communities can do to increase revenue or control costs in 2023. Couple logistical things before we really get into the content. We typically go through the webinars and deliver the information first. Our goal is to try and get that done by right around 1 o'clock or so. And then we shift into a Q&A session that would last, if needed, up till 1:30. And that would be the end time if we go that far. So you are welcome to submit questions anytime through the webinars they occur to you. And if you see the little example here of the Zoom control panel, there's a Q&A tab there, and you just click on that and you can type in whatever question you have, and we'll then address those as we get to them at the end. Please do not use the chat function, though, to ask your questions. They go to a different place, and that's handled a different way in Zoom. So please use the Q&A. And of course, the one question we always get the most and earliest is, will you be sending out a copy of the presentation? And the answer is yes, of course, and not only a copy, but it's one better than that. Everyone who registered, not just everyone who's here today, will get a link to a full recording of the webinar. So you can go back and re-listen to certain parts of it, share it with others in your organization. We highly encourage you to do that. We do this to try and help educate and help people in the senior living field. So with that, would like to start by introducing our panelists. Rob Clark is joining us for the first time on one of our webinars. And Rob, if you could take just a moment and introduce yourself and tell just a little bit to our attendees today about OnePoint Partners.
Sure. Thank you, Rob. Welcome, everyone. My name is Rob Clark. I'm a managing director at OnePoint Partners, overseeing operations and community performance support services. OnePoint Partners is a full-service senior living advisory firm, and we engage in development, operations, capital planning, financial analysis, marketing, sales, and strategic advisory. So that's why we're here today.
All right. And Sarah.
Hello, I'm Sarah Montalto, Senior Vice President of Strategic Services at Love & Company. I oversee our marketing intelligence and sales services, along with lead marketing strategies for turnaround.
All right. And again, I'm Rob Love. I'm the president owner of Love & Company. And if we have any new people joining us for the first time today that may not be familiar with Love & Company, we are a firm that specializes solely in senior living, and we provide marketing research, consumer research services, marketing planning, all the creative and branding, lead generation work, and sales advisory services. So again, thank you all for joining us here today. We're going to start off today. I'm going to lead off with discussion of the real estate market and where it is today and what that may mean for us in the coming year. Because obviously real estate and the ability for prospects to sell their homes is a very key part of how the sales dynamic works for independent living in most lifeline communities. From that starting point, Sarah will take over and talk about a number of different strategies communities can use to increase revenue. You could do today from entrance and monthly fees. We'll hand it off to Rob. He'll talk about revenue strategies for skilled nursing, a lot of things that communities overlook or could benefit from paying even closer attention to than they may already be doing. And then he'll shift into addressing more operational and finance strategies to enhance margins. Then we'll close with the Q&A period at the end. So that's our game plan for today. And as I said earlier, today is the first of a two-part series that we're going to be doing with OnePoint Partners. And the theme of today is really, what can you come away? We want to give you ideas that you can walk away from today with and say, we can start doing this week, this month, and start really generating revenue and improve your margins this year. But a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today are shorter term, or maybe not shorter term, but they're kind of one-time things, steps that you can't take again and again, year after year. Once you get it in place, they're in place. So a lot of the inflationary pressures that we face look like they may be continuing for a little while. A lot of the margin pressures, things like increasing staffing costs, that's not going to go away anytime soon. So in part two, we're going to come back 4 weeks from today on March 28th with two other partners from One Point Partners, Mike Keewald and Toby Shea. And we're going to be looking longer term at that point at how do you reset and really look at your organization, and are you positioned, are you offering the right services, doing the right things to be able to maximize margins well into the future. So short term, long term between our two webinars. Today, I want to get us started with a discussion of the real estate market. And as we said, of course, we all know how critical that is, particularly to independent living sales. And, this past year, mortgage rates have, increased pretty dramatically relative to where they had been. We've seen some slowdowns in the housing market. And what's really going on, and what does that mean for us? So we did a bit of a deep dive into this recently. I want to share the results with you. And we'll also continue to share updates on this as we move through the year. So the first thing is what we're all most immediately aware of. If we look at the last 5-year period and what's happened with mortgage interest rates, it's taken a pretty sharp jump up over the last, particularly really the last year, 13, 14 months. And if you look historically over this 5-year period, we're now a good bit higher than we had been anytime during that period. So a lot of people start to have fear of, okay, what's this going to do to the housing market? Is it going to slow things down or shut things down? But the picture gets a little different when you start to stretch the time period out more and look at the last 50 years, as this chart does. And now you see a very different story, which is how abnormally low mortgage interest rates have been, particularly the last 2 years or so prior to the increase in 2022. And so where we are right now, hovering around that 6% level, is from a broader historical perspective, not only just reasonable with where rates have tended to be over a longer period of time, but actually it's pretty good. And we have had some really healthy real estate markets around that 6% interest level. So it really should not be in any way a death knell for the real estate market. We're going to show you more data to support that. So I'm going to have several of these graphs that have up to 5 years of data on them. So I'm going to walk through them kind of slowly to make sure they're clear. But each color here is a year. And in this particular graph, the oldest year, 2019, is the greenish gray line on the bottom. And what this chart is showing is the median home resale value, because most people come from us, they're not, we don't deal that much with buying new homes. We're looking at people selling their homes and what's the value of that. And what we see in 2019 is it's starting off a little bit low, increasing during the middle of the year, then dropping back down a little bit towards the end of the year, though not that much. And while this isn't really a very dramatic change during the course of the year, the story it tells us is actually that this is a much more typical year, because this is what we normally experience in the real estate market. It's at its lowest resale value, December, January, February. As the spring months come in and go into summer, it peaks in that June, July timeframe before home values falling off again towards the end of the year. That's the peak selling season. And that's a very historical trend. What's not an historical trend is what we've experienced the last several years. So now we shift into 2020, which is the gold line right above that. And we see a typical increase early in the year, followed by a little lull in that. Well, this is the effects of COVID. And then we see something very unusual in the latter part of 2020, which is home values basically keep going up and then hold steady through the end of the year. We get to 2021 in blue, and it takes another sharp increase up, again, peaking in the middle of the year, but staying pretty level from that point on through the end of the year. We then, at the beginning of 2022, the red line, jumped up even further. And again, peaked mid-year before starting to drop off in what in many ways is a relatively normal drop off for the second half of the year, and not necessarily can be looked at as, oh, mortgage rates increase, so now prices are falling. It's normal for them to fall in the second half of the year. The question is, how much are they falling? And way over here, you'll see this on several graphs. There's the first data point for 2023. And what we see is, despite the substantial increase in interest rates over the last year, even through the end of December of 2022 and in January of 23, home resale values are still higher than they were a year earlier. So we're still gaining value on a year-to-year basis. How much that will continue, that's a question we'll have to see. But truly, the bottom is not dropping out of this. We're actually seem to be reverting more to a little bit of a normal pattern. Another thing that is interesting to see, and part of what has a significant impact on the sustaining those home resale values, is how many homes are being sold. And that's what this next chart shows us, the number of home resales over the last 5 years. Again, the same color scheme. We start here in the grayish green, and see that through most of the year, the annual sales pace was hovering somewhere between about 4.5 million and 5 million sales. It increased a little bit at the beginning of 2020 before taking a sharp dip due entirely to COVID, and then a very dramatic rise, unlike anything we've seen. It's definitely a COVID impact, helping drive home sales along with lower interest rates. But it's a very abnormal chart to see for the year. Then we get into 2021, and the number of sales actually, and very unusually, starts at a higher level at the beginning of the year, drops off a little bit before again building back up to a pretty high level through the end of the year. Where we really start to see a significant change then is 2022. And this is where the mortgage interest rates have had the greatest impact. As rates steadily went up, it obviously became more expensive to buy a house for many people. And so the number of sales dropped off. And we see it dropping down to about 3.6 million. And over here in January, we're still hovering right about 3.6 million in annual volume, compared to where we were 4 years ago in the beginning of 2019. That's about a 20% drop in volume. But again, that's not the bottom dropping out of the market. So there has been an impact on the number of homes sold from the mortgage rate increases. Now, another way to look at home resale volume and the market dynamics is to look at sales and look at supply and demand in terms of the month's supply of existing single-family homes. And this is basically a statistic that tells you, based on the number of homes that are available for sale on the market and the pace at which homes are currently selling, how quickly would we sell out if no additional homes came on the market? So you see, again, back in 2019, our first line, we started out with just under 4 months supply. It increased to about 4.5 months, and then dropped down by the end of the year to about 3. 2020, again, that COVID impact, sales slowed, so the amount of supply significantly increased, the month's supply went up, and then as sales rapidly took off, went down to a less than 2 months supply of homes. That, I've been tracking real estate sales for a long time because of the importance to our field, and I've never seen anything like that. Things that were coming on the market were selling really quickly. 2021 in blue started out that same way, held fairly steady between 2 and 2.5 months supply. But it wasn't until the mortgage interest rates ticked up, started moving up at the beginning of 2022, that we saw that month supply go back up. But it's still not, if you look at the end of 2022 and over here, the single dot at the beginning of 2023, it's still not as high as it was in 2019, which was a really good seller's market still at that time. Things were moving pretty well. And so that's one of the takeaways from all this, is that demand is still, even with reduced volume of sales, demand is still at a positive relationship to supply. And that's what's sustaining home resale values. So, kind of brief summary of all these points we've been making. Really, the dramatic increase in the value of home sales, how much they sold for, was really driven much more by a sharp increase in demand, coupled but with limited supply. But it was the ultimate seller's market. Now, low interest rates absolutely helped and accelerated it, but it wasn't solely due to low interest rates. And so certainly the recent increases in rates have slowed demand, but that relationship between supply and demand is still favorable, which is what's holding up the home resale value. So we're still ahead of last year. That's really the last several bullets there together, so I won't repeat them all. But what's really, so it's encouraging so far, but of course what we don't know is what's going to happen moving forward. Mortgage rates have actually fallen the last couple of months, despite the Fed continuing to tick up the federal interest rate. And so will the mortgage rates continue to fall? They are a different item from the Fed rate. And will demand start increasing again as people, we normalize again around a 6% interest rate, and we get into normal sales periods of spring and summer being peak months? It'll be really interesting and important to continue to watch this over the next couple of months and see, do we start to bounce back? Do we fall behind last year? I suspect we won't hit as high a resale value in the middle of summer as we had last year, but the indications are it still should be going up from where it is now. But we'll have to wait and see on that. And if you'd like to follow along, about every other month or every quarter, we will be taking all this data, updating it, and posting a blog on it. So we encourage you to follow our blogs on our website. You can see all this data from a couple months ago spelled out there, and we'll revisit that again soon. So with that, again, as the backdrop to what's happening in the housing market, knowing that the housing market has so much of an impact on where we can go with some of our entrance fee pricing, I'll hand it off to Sarah to start talking about some more immediate strategies communities can take to increase revenue.
Thank you, Rob. So what I'm going to go through is, as Rob mentioned, different strategies to increase revenue. And I'm sure you're not surprised that one of the first strategies we're going to talk about is adjusting entrance fees. So one of the key things that we talk about with entrance fees is that they need to be in alignment with home values in the market. In an ideal scenario for a declining balance like care contract, that should be priced just below median home values, where the high refund plan with 80 to 90% refundable should be about 20% higher than median. And when we're looking at situations where anything greater than this, it's really going to decrease demand for your product. The question becomes—
Hey, Sarah, could I jump in for a second? There just was a comment raised, and I was noticing it too. Your audio is not coming across quite as strongly. I don't know if there's anything you could do to be a little closer to the mic or anything, but it was hard for people to follow.
You know what? Let's try something. All right, what about now?
Oh, much better.
Perfect. All right, so I'm actually just going to start back at the beginning of this slide. So what we're really looking at is how is your weighted average home values in your market compared to your
average entrance fees. And what we really want to see is that if you have a declining balance life care contract, that it's priced a little below that median home value. Whereas if you're looking at a high refund contract, we're talking the 80 to 90% refundable range, that we want to see that that's priced about 100% of the median home values. If we're looking at a scenario where you're priced significantly above these points, it's going to reduce the demand for your community. The question really becomes with whether we can and shift some of this inflationary revenue pressure onto your. In looking at the increase of entrance fees versus home values over the past 20 years, typically, according to Ziegler, entrance fee annual increases are about 3%. If you look at that compared to the typical entrance fees, that you'll notice over time, looking at in that 2014 range, 2016, where they were pretty much in alignment versus the significant increases in home values over the past 5 to 7 years, that now it could be up to a 46% gap between where median home values are and what entrance fee increases have been over time. So if you think about this in terms of a 200 residents community and looking at if you were to do an 8% increase, which is what many communities are considering right now, to keep their income in alignment with what's happening with inflation to all costs of the community. So if there's a $4,000 average monthly fee and an 8% increase, it's about $320 per month. So about $38.40 per residence per year. So that increase translates into a $768,000 increase in revenue, which it's a lot of money and communities aren't going to turn that down. But on the other side of things, if you look at an average entrance fee for that same 200 residents community of $259, if we were to apply half of that increase, so not 46%, but 23%, there would be a nearly $61,000 increase in entry fees. So you need to turn over about 16 residences to hit the break-even point with the monthly fee increase. So typical turnover with 12 to 13 units per year results in 25 residents annually turning over. Overall, that 23% increase becomes a $1.5 million increase in entrance fee cash flow. So it's nearly double what was achieved with the monthly fee increase. And I know the question that you're all thinking, having heard that, is, can you really increase entrance fees that much? And this really comes back to what your communities look like. What is your market position? And we'll get to that later on. But overall, what we really need to be thinking of to increase the revenue into your community, it is likely going to need to be a combination of both entrance fee and monthly fee adjustments in order to get the revenue that you need due to inflation. So our next strategy talks about looking at the fees for your most in-demand residences. So we have an internal pricing analysis that was done here. This is for a single building at a community. So no differences in major attributes, but really looking at how that cost per square foot declines over time, or I'm sorry, as the size increases. And the things that we know from the basics of supply and demand is that as demand is greater than supply, we can increase prices, whereas when supply is greater than demand, which is what is happening with those one-bedroom units, we really need to look at decreasing prices. So by taking this unit mix and actually really reallocating and repricing it to make better sense within the market, you can see here the net entrance fee potential is only $16,000. And what that means is the changes shown above in that cost per square foot are really revenue neutral. We're not really getting any more entrance fee revenue for that same unit mix. However, the community is currently sitting at 63% occupancy in its one-bedroom units. If by decreasing the pricing from where it is now for those smaller units, and then having that offset by the increasing the pricing for those larger, more in-demand units, it actually is an entrance fee gain of $2.3 million that they're not able to achieve right now because the supply outpaces demand for those smaller units. So this is a strategy that is really focused on what can be done to the pricing of your overall community so that you can help equalize supply and demand so that you can achieve stabilized occupancy in all of your residences. So the third thing that I'm going to go through today is the individual residence pricing. And while we know senior living isn't a purely real estate transaction, we know that there are different attributes, and we use a big one that really impact how much somebody is willing to pay for a individual residence. So somebody having that courtyard view where you're looking out at greenery versus a parking lot view, it's not going to be worth more to all of your prospects, but it's definitely going to be worth more to some of your prospects. So what we like to do is really meet with teams and evaluate what are the right factors for your community. So we've identified some of the top factors for when we work with communities on this type of model, but really looking at your overall inventory for view, distance from primary amenities, floor plan premium. Sometimes it's first floor and top floor. Others with high-rise buildings, it might be floor 12 and above with the percentage of premium increasing for each floor flight, and really go what makes sense. Patios and balconies, that could be if some units have them and some don't. For other communities, they have select units with 2 balconies, or they have select units with significantly larger balconies. The key with this is it really needs to make sense for a particular community and really understanding what different attributes have value in the eyes of their prospects. And then it's really going through and assigning those value differences by amenities for both the increases and the decreases. And this is something that is very much needs to be a conversation with your sales teams, that they're hearing the prospect feedback on these attributes, and they know what are the things that people are paying more for. And they know if all things are priced equal, then they know what are the things that are causing somebody to go, no, I'll wait until something else is available. It may not be something that's meaningful to the person, but if I don't have to pay any more for the best view, and I can wait another year for it and delay the decision that I may not be ready to make, I'm going to lean on that as my reasoning. Overall, what we look to see a community do with this is that the overall impact of these types of adjustment should be revenue neutral to revenue positive. We've seen communities increase potential entrance fee revenue from between $1 to more than $5 million. It really has to do with what your inventory is, and also whether or not you have more inventory with some of those really strong positive factors that prospects are willing to pay more for. The next strategy is contract option adjustments. And for this, it could be the refundability of the contract. For example, if you have a community that's 90% refundable, is there an option to move it to an 80% refund? So if the entrance fee is $500,000, if they were to make this change, overall, it's an additional $50,000 in sale from that same inventory. Rob, I think there was something that you had wanted to share about a community that had done this sort of exercise.
Actually, it's one or two more slides. It's in the next slide. But thanks for remembering that.
Okay. Another thing is contract benefits. So with a Type B or life care contract, I was actually on a call earlier today, and the question was asked of me of what is the standard Type B contract? And quite honestly, there isn't. It just needs to make sense for your market. So if you're in a market that has a lot of Type B contracts and they're all offering 10 days of healthcare benefit for that Type B contract, and you're doing the 10 days plus a 10% discount at a similar price, there might be an opportunity to really look at what that contract offering is and how we can have, maybe reduce some of that while still providing the value, but be more in line with the market.
So Sarah, that's where I'll just pick up for a moment. There was an example of a community I worked with probably close to 10 years ago on this, but we did competitive pricing analysis. Sarah's going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And really found that for the sizes and types of residences that this community offered, they were substantially overpriced relative to the market, particularly on the monthly fee side, like easily $1,000 or more higher than every competitor. And the product they were offering at that time, honestly, was not, well, not only was it not ahead of the competition, it was behind the competition. So there was a definite mismatch, and census had dropped all the way to 83%. So there were a number of things we looked at there, but one of the things that came out of that was determining that their life care contract covered a lot more things than competitors' life care contracts did, from prescriptions to, I don't even remember at this point what it all was, but there was a really long list of things. It was a very rich contract. It was great if you were a resident, it was perfect, but it also was contributing to them outpricing the market significantly. And so by restructuring that contract, but keeping it in line with market expectations, we were able to reduce the price without affecting margins of the community or competitiveness.
Thanks, Rob. But that leads us to here with influencing contract selection. It really looking at how you're priced relative, how your contracts are priced relative to each other really impacts what somebody is likely to select, and knowing where you want to drive contract selection really should be shown out in your pricing. So the last thing we're going to talk about in this section is really what you can do, what you can and should do. What are the steps to move forward and evaluate this? So the first really is evaluating entrance fees versus home values. Do they make sense for your market? Do they make sense relative to the increases in real estate in your market? The second is complete an internal pricing analysis. And that goes back to what we showed with where that decrease in entrance fee per square foot in those larger units that had the greater demand. But do you have any anomalies that are impacting what somebody is likely to select? I worked with a client several years ago where the cost difference between their largest apartments and their cottages were nearly identical, but they only had 12 cottages, and there was such strong demand and such a strong wait list that people wanted to wait years and years for that cottage, even though they weren't going to be able to move in a more reasonable time frame. But since it was only, maybe $10,000 more, that they felt like waiting was worthwhile. And our recommendation was to actually increase that entrance fee so that people would be more willing to take the largest 2-bedroom with den where there was some availability, because now if they wanted a cottage, it might be $30,000 more. The next is really look at the contract option analysis, both in terms of actuarial margin, see if can you modify any of your contracts to provide a better return for the community in a way that makes sense for prospects. Next is really conducting a lifetime pricing analysis versus your competitors. And this is really understanding with different contract options, are you providing a better or worse value than what your competitors are, looking at similarly sized and types of units. Once you have that, it's really adding the positioning component, because now you know how you're priced relative to them. Next, you need to be able to answer the question, does that make sense based on what your actual product is? So if you have a premium tiered product, but you're at the midpoint for pricing, then there's an opportunity to increase your pricing to bring your product and pricing in alignment. On the other hand, if you're at the highest point for pricing, but you have two communities that are, have a better product but are priced less, then you're going to have a harder time increasing that pricing. So it's really understanding where you stand. And then once your overall pricing is in the right place, that's at the point that you can really implement a residence pricing model to say, for your most desirable units for a variety of different attributes, how can we bring pricing into alignment with how much somebody is willing to pay for it? And now I'm going to hand it off to Rob to talk about increasing revenue from nursing.
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit of what One Point is seen within the senior living advisory work that we do. And what I put together is just some high level places operators often get stuck that when addressed can go a long way to improve their overall performance. And either way, it's healthy to take a fresh look at your community's performance versus industry benchmark and standards to make sure that you are optimizing all of your opportunities. Most of us find the 5-star rating system tedious, confusing, but we definitely need to take it seriously. And a few things impact your ability to build relationships with your hospitals and providers and your star rating, as much as we might not want to admit it. But an example, quality measures like rehospitalizations, they'll impact your star rating. So it makes sense to build effective protocols and to train and retrain staff, especially with the labor challenges these days. There's a lot of turnover that's sometimes causing bad habits to get pushed to the next hire. So commonly misunderstood aspect that we need to think a little bit more about these days. We'll partner with hospitals, pharmacies, therapy to coordinate admissions and discharges and make sure your protocols serve the patient, not the providers. And what I mean by that is make sure that what you're doing serves the patient's best interests, isn't just intended to make your life easier or the other providers' lives easier. Take a look at your care expertise and the acuity that you're accepting. It's understandable to fear clinical risk, but you do have to embrace it to one degree or another, and prepare for it. Equip your team to embrace it. Identify the weaknesses, maybe their lack of private rooms or specific equipment, and manage around them, but also identify what you're good at and consistently can deliver. Ensure your staff are clearly and frequently educated on new admissions, new equipment, and new protocols. Example of a 60-bed SNF in Indiana, worked with a while back. They're providing good care, but they were really steering clear of higher acuity admissions. So to help them lean into some more clinical risk, we identified there were on their team 3 nurses that had cardiac unit experience recently in the hospital. So we thought we could turn that energy into a healthy partnership with the hospital, and met with their chief cardiologist to get her input on what the physical plant needs would be, any equipment recommendations, clinical training specifically for CHF care. And we were able to reduce their hospitalizations by nearly half for CHF admissions. Another aspect that we're focused on for nursing revenue is quality MDS coding. Ensure that you're capturing all the services you're providing. It's also worthwhile to note to make sure that you have a backup, to make sure your billing can continue, reimbursements can continue to flow. You can employ an LPN to input your MDS, but they do need an RN to sign off. So commonly misunderstood aspect of the MDS process. Make sure your contributing department knows their role and if possible, how their documentation impacts reimbursements. I can think back to before I was a nursing home administrator as a social worker. I remember taking some shortcuts in my brain on some of the wraps and wanting to just cut corners a little bit, but really had to keep reorienting myself to this is a different patient with a different set of medications and expected outcomes. So really try not to get too much stuck in a rut of that documentation. And make sure you keep up and your MDS nurses keep up on the changes within CMS and their MDS protocols, different recommendations. They do update the site fairly frequently. So it's worthwhile to keep track of that. So in this example, this 114-bed SNF in Pennsylvania had a 5-star rating. They were struggling to keep an MDS coordinator, so no one was really an expert at the community. So as I'd mentioned earlier, sometimes we'll see bad habits pass from one person to another. And in this case, this was an example that they weren't capturing IV fluid administered in the hospital, poor tracking of diagnosis and documentation. So we were able to analyze their coding and recommended changes that would increase the revenues by about $40,000 per quarter. So, and in this situation, it calls to mind, we recommend using a third party to audit your MDS work. It helps reduce the risk that the misinformed are leading the misinformed, like we saw at this particular community. Last on the nursing revenue recommendations is quality cost reports. So this is often viewed as an expense item of sorts, and it is part of that, yes, but it directly impacts your Medicare reimbursements. And for those in case mix index states with Medicaid, it directly affects your Medicaid rates. So some common cost report mistakes that are made, inaccurate census data, inaccurate reporting of non-allowable, non-reimbursable expenses, failure to report bad debt expense and recovery. So there's quite a few that get overlooked that can be improved. So we often recommend a third party prepare cost reports, as they're typically more fluent within state and federal cost report guidelines. And it's yet another way to, if you will, screen what you're doing and make sure that you're keeping up with the changes that are out there. So a bit of a case study on cost reports. 80-bed SNF in Nebraska, their low skilled mix had the missing operating margin target. So they fell into some of the same mistakes other providers do that were mentioned on the previous slide. There was bad debt expense and recoveries reporting. They were approaching the cost reports with a GAAP frame of mind, a generally accepted accounting principles frame of mind, among other opportunities. It's really a cost report. You have to look at it somewhat as a worksheet. It doesn't always follow typical accounting protocols. And they were losing about $12 a day in Medicare reimbursements and about $10 a day in Medicaid. And at this community with its low skilled mix, really Medicaid was keeping the lights on. And so they really need to balance out, the care they were providing and how they were documenting it.
And Rob, if you don't mind me jumping in there, when we were walking through all this or earlier, getting ready for the webinar, just did some quick math on that. And $10 a day per case doesn't necessarily sound like a lot. But if you do the math and figure $10 a day times 30 days a month times 80 beds times 12 months and et cetera, that's a total revenue gain potential of close to $300,000. And even if, I think you said they were operating at about 60 out of 80 beds, that's at 3/4 of that, it's still more than $200,000. So a little bit goes a long, long way.
Yeah, it's very true. And I think with a lot of these types of experiences that we've had, you're chipping away a little here, a little bit there, and it does really add up. I think and I'll speak to this later, but it's easy to get comfortable with how you do things. And it's healthy to take a look at what other ways there are to approach the operations. So on that note, moving to the larger campus and the expense side of the larger campus. It's easy, as I mentioned just a second ago, to make sure you're being realistic about your organization. You may not be running as tight a ship as you think. So continue to review your expense approaches and avoid assuming that you're doing everything as best you can. Ensure your departments are using up-to-date industry benchmarks versus a straight percentage increase in expenses each year. We often see that operators for 5, 6, 7 years, they just add 2 or 3 more percent expenses each year, and they wander far away from the benchmarks that are typically performance standards that keep them on track. So their expenses in some categories go up when they shouldn't, and they go down when they shouldn't. It's important to make sure your department heads have a budget, but it needs to remain top of mind. Talk about it throughout the year. Make sure each department is part of the budget creation because you want them to have ownership of the outcome. And keep up on your industry news like McKnight's, Senior Housing News, and webinars like Loving Company is doing today. Keep yourself informed. Engage with organizations like Leading Age and Argentum, and try to keep up on technology. Just recently saw robotic servers in a dining room, and it was really an eye-opening experience. I've heard about it, but actually seeing it in action, they really worked, and they really were able to address some of the labor challenges that community was experiencing. So on the being realistic about your organization, a case study in Ohio, they were not making their debt covenants, and it thought it was specifically a reflection of how performance was during COVID, but as such, they didn't really believe that their operations were in question. But we encourage them to really let's take a look under the hood and see where their opportunities are. And we did find outdated performance benchmarks, high maintenance costs that preventive maintenance could have alleviated, as well as some of the software that supports preventive maintenance, too many beds, high administrative staffing, supervisors supervising supervisors, and so forth. Department heads that did not have budgets to work from and weren't involved in their creation. So lots of opportunity there. And at this particular community, it yielded about $500,000 in savings. And it didn't compromise quality of care or revenues or expenses in a way that really put anyone at risk in any way. It's certainly not something that we would put second. Second focus, be realistic about staffing. Ask yourself, do people even want to work here? I think it's easy to fall into the trap that, it's typical, it's hard to find labor really anywhere in this economy, in this market, but there are things that can improve that. One point, conducted a labor roundtable with HR professionals all across the industry. And the one theme that they kept coming back to that helped them with retention was when they were at a community or worked for a company that had a great culture for employees. So again, ask yourself, do people want to work here, and what can we do to keep them here? A great way to do that is, anonymous employee survey. You may not like what you hear, but if you don't, that means there's things that you can address, and that's an opportunity. Before you add staff, make sure that there's, not a better technology or better training that might solve the challenge, and make sure that the employee knows what their role is and how their performance is being tracked, so that everyone's on the same page. It might be just a simple conversation that could alleviate a performance shortfall. And lastly, five-star care, it does not depend on overstaffing. It depends on accurate staffing, making sure that your care providers are all trained and the partners that you work with are as well, and that you're documenting all of your service delivery. So case study, of community in Cleveland. And mind you, this is the second Ohio reference, and it's not because I live in Michigan. I just want to be clear about that to anyone that might question that. This is just simply coincidental. But they misunderstood some of the staffing requirements of their license, specifically the RN requirement of the QM measurement. And what we found was about $1 million in overstaffing, $770,000 of which was specifically to replacement staffing of that overstaffing. So I'll give you an example. If a community needs 5 nurses on a specific shift, and they're instead employing 6, when that sixth person doesn't show up or calls in and they're replacing it with someone with time and a half or sometimes 2.5 times the cost of, with an agency cost, now they've exponentially added to their staffing challenges. Just replacing that one person now becomes an even more expensive person. So really ask yourself, are there other systems that could be in place to make the experience for the patient and the care quality as good with the staff that you have available to you, instead of just throwing staff at it? So for example, there are technologies like OnShift, ShiftHound. These are applications that can take over some of the staffing challenges that schedulers have. And in this particular community, they had a scheduler on each level of living just because managing labor was such a headache, and also managing all the various agencies that were working within their campus. And lastly, this is an expense that we feel strongly about at One Point because it definitely brings you a benefit. Be realistic about your marketing and sales. We see typically communities that are most successful in a CCRC type of setting, and really much of senior living, is they're investing 3 to 5% of their revenues towards sales marketing exercises. So we did see quite a few pause this during COVID to try and save money. But I think what we have also seen is generally with those communities, their ramp up for occupancy post-COVID has been very slow. And sometimes in some situations, it's jeopardized their ability to function, at least even at a stabilized point. And additionally, we see clients that have a marketing plan, but not a real strategy behind that plan. A plan is more procedural, but a strategy addresses the full strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats of their thinking. Specifically, product positioning. Sarah mentioned this earlier in the presentation. If you're the top tier provider, but you're charging mid-level rates, well, that's great for the resident. They probably see the value in that, but you're leaving revenue on the table and you're providing services that increase your costs. So you want to find that balance, make sure that you're positioned right, that your price fits accordingly. And then lastly, you promote all that with solid advertising that brings that together and syncs up that position that you have in the market and with your pricing so that they line up. And the last component of this, sales expectations. You definitely, you want to hold sales accountable by enforcing expectations and making sure they use the CRMs, or customer relationship management systems, because if it's not documented, it didn't happen. There's no way to verify that. But by that documentation, you can really fine tune your approaches, see where your opportunities are, and then also find out what you're doing well so you can continue doing that. But the flip side of that is when sales decline, make sure that there's not a marketing strategy problem like I suggested earlier. Is it a product positioning issue, a pricing oversight? And I say this lightly, but don't immediately shoot the salesperson. That's not always the solution. I think a lot of communities that we work with that are struggling with occupancy, it's a natural tendency to look towards the sales team and say, what can we do differently? And in some of these situations, we'll see salespeople that have been in there for quite a while, and so it would be odd that sales had changed. And we just find that the marketing approach and some of the product positioning just needs to be adjusted. A case study of a community we worked with in Illinois. Their aisle occupancy collapsed when they shut down marketing efforts. This was post-COVID, during COVID, and then post-COVID really felt the impact of that. The community leaders believed that the sales team was really the problem here, but we found them to be very savvy, knowledgeable about their market, some really great ways that they were handling objections. They were documenting their activity in the CRM, which really allowed us insight into the sales process. So, obviously we looked at their product positioning and some of their marketing efforts to see if there was an opportunity there. And one of the things that we determined, and this is definitely something that Sarah had spoken to earlier, their contracts weren't making financial sense to the prospects and their value was lost. They just didn't line up, the monthly fees with the services they provided versus the value that they were getting for it. And their per square foot pricing was too high for the market. They perceived themselves as a nicer, higher level provider than they actually were. So we had to have a real conversation about, where they sit in the market and how they can price accordingly based upon the amenities that they offered. So implementing these changes really began to stabilize their occupancy and revenue and really begin their recovery post-COVID.
All right, thanks, Rob, and thanks, Sarah. We're a couple minutes ahead of 1 o'clock, so our timing today was really good. We got all that done, and we will shift into the general discussion timeframe. Now, we do have a couple of questions sitting here. Actually want to ask you something, Rob, first, based on some of the conversations again that we had, because you've come across some pretty innovative, not quite sure I want to call it solutions, but innovative things communities have done that help with revenue one way or another. And I think one of the stories you told was of a community and what they did with excess food. And I don't remember the full story, but I remember it was interesting when you told it. That may be interesting to our viewers as well to hear a little more about that.
Yeah, Rob, there was a community that we visited in Pennsylvania. They actually had those robotic servers that I was sharing a little bit about earlier. But they also were very conservative with how they handled their food waste. So they had served salmon the night before and had a fair amount left over. They were repackaging that food for sale in their cafe the next day. It didn't keep long, but it sold quickly. And so they were able to really manage their waste processes closely. And so things like that, that's an example of, you hear that in theory, but when you see it in action, you see that it can happen. It's reassuring, and it shows you too that I know for me, I'm always learning and keeping my mind open for other ways to approach these things. Just because we see lots of different communities, there's always something new to be learned.
Right, thank you. So Sarah, first question, gonna pop your way. It came in right when you had finished the third of your 4 pricing recommendations. 1, really opportunities to increase entrance fees. 2, rebalancing pricing between residences. And 3, individual residence pricing adjustments. And the question was, how do you evaluate those strategies in relation to a large waiting list? So community has a lot of people on the waiting list. Now they're starting to look at maybe some significant changes and increases to how they're doing entrance fees or things. How would you think about that?
So the biggest thing there, it's not a one size fits all answer. Communities choose to roll this out in a variety of different ways. That they may say somebody on the wait list, if they're making a commitment within 6 months of the new pricing strategies rolling out, that they would not have to pay a higher price, but it is something that needs to be communicated. A lot of communities that I work with do share annual updates to their pricing with their overall wait list. So if that's something that you're doing, it could be made part of that communication. It could also be done in terms of a wait list luncheon where you roll that out. It's something that most communities are looking at. They don't want to lose a sale over during that first 6 to 12 months. Once you get beyond that, it's really just the new pricing strategy and how the community is being priced, but it's really having it in terms of that if there are some of these attributes that aren't meaningful to a prospect, that they're able to get the floor plan style that they want for less money than they would have otherwise. So not only are, yes, certain units are going up, but they're being offset by other units going down, and that it's really a reevaluation of the pricing strategy for the community and really in response to how prospects prepare to pay for things. So if it's not meaningful, they can select a different unit, and really having that be part of the conversation.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that too, Sarah. just the fundamental principle of any kind of significant change is communication and education. And how do you let your market know, your prospects know what you're doing and why you're doing it? Everybody knows inflation has been high. Most people know that the real estate market went up a long way. And if you go to implement several things that do have a significant impact on entrance fees over time, but you educate and reach out to these people, here's what we're doing, here's why. By doing it this way, we're able to control the impact of our monthly fee increases have on our residents. You know, there's a real positive spin on a lot of these strategies. And as Sarah was just saying, on the individual residence pricing, you know, you might actually get the kind of residents you wanted for lower price than we were at before. So it's you know, a good bit of education along the way and communication to let them know what you're doing, why, and how people may fit into that. The next question came up, Rob, while you were talking about the marketing side of things, and it may be something that all three of us may contribute to in some way or other. The question is, what's the right compensation package for the marketing and sales team? And Rob, maybe you can take a first stab at that. Sarah, get your thoughts on it as well. And I know I have a couple too, but go ahead.
Sure. I think there's been, you know, a tradition, I would say, in senior living of having a base salary and, you know, earning a commission on a per sales basis. Certainly on the rental side and on the entrance fee side, you know, different variations of that. I'm going to have maybe a different answer to this and leave it open for Rob and Sarah to maybe offer their opinion, their thoughts on it. But I also feel like wherever possible, to put a commission plan in place for your executive director, or for even in cases where maybe you are a little heavier on the nursing side, some sort of incentives to really embrace acuity in maybe your other levels of living, because they're all participants in the quality of the services provided, and they're all participants in making sure that door is open. I don't think the door is open as wide when there's some challenges to what might be, you know, required for their care. But I think I found that to be helpful to really bring the team together and all, you know, realizing the benefits of embracing move-ins on any level of care.
So when I actually saw this question come in earlier or just yesterday, I was looking at the June 2022 Ziegler CFO hotline survey. So currently 71% of single sites and 85% of multi-site organizations are paying a commission to the sales and marketing team. Now, the timing of that payment varies, and also how it's weighted to prior to move-in versus after move-in also varies by community, but that's a good place that you can go to get some information to really do a comparison of how you compare to communities out there. But I agree that having that compensation package that's really rewarding the type of activity that we want to see, that for an operating community, having commissions that are more heavily weighted towards move-in. But in terms of total compensation, it really is so location dependent, cost of living, what your competitors are paying, that having a compensation package that's in alignment with what your market is paying right now and allows you to attract top tier talent.
And my answer is more anecdotal, but it builds on a little bit of what you were saying there. Yes, you can't, we can't just spout out, oh, the base should be this much and the per sale should be this much, because there's a huge difference on whether your community is located in Manhattan, Kansas, or Manhattan, New York. You know, there's this pretty substantial difference to that. However, a way to think about it is, and this is the anecdotal part, there was a CEO we worked with once who said, I don't care if the salespeople are the highest paid people in the community. Because if they are, and they're getting that through their performance, then they are providing a tremendous value to the community. So that's just more of a philosophical way to look at it. If you have someone that's really good, that is making your numbers, you think of the difference in your bottom line revenue if you're at 90% versus 95% full, it's massive. And being able to put together a sales package, a compensation package for a salesperson that really rewards them well for doing well, it's a win-win scenario for the community. So a couple of different takes on that answer. Next question is, what are some good marketing strategies? And I'm gonna take a first stab at that, but also open up to others to contribute as well. Because we did some work, analyze all our clients' results over the last several years. And what we saw, this was done last summer, was from 2018 through 2021, early 22, the number of leads that our communities were getting through digital means had more than tripled, and the number of sales that they were. Are you still hearing me okay?
Your audio's in and out.
Okay, yeah, I just got a weird little message on screen. So, okay. So the whole digital marketing world is just really critical to our communities today. And it's not just getting a lead, but we did a whole webinar on this. So earlier we shared the web address to the blog. If you go to our website, there's a list of all past webinars that we've done. And back in October, we did one on digital marketing, all the different components of it, from generating a lead through nurturing a lead to closing the sale. So I would encourage you to go look at that for some additional information. Sarah, not sure what you or Rob may want to add to that.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is that all of your marketing strategies need to work together and should be planned with that in mind, that you're having a cohesive brand strategy, brand image, so that when you're seeing the community in different places being advertised, plus then when you're going there for that in-person experience, it all makes sense together. About a month or so ago, I actually had the experience of going to a community in person and viewing their materials in advance, that my expectations were actually set lower than what the in-person experience was. So that's a community that's going to be working towards updating their branding to be really reflective of what the community is actually like, so that they can get more people through the doors. And all of that stuff really needs to make sense when looked at across the board.
Thank you. There's one more question here, which will be kind of quick to answer, and we've got a bit of time left. So if anybody does have any other questions, please add them into the list. We're happy to address them. Good, there came one more. But the question that was there was, will the slides be sent out after the webinar? And just for anyone who joined us later in the process, we do one better than sending out the slides. Everyone who registered, whether you were actually here or not, will receive a link to a full recording of the webinar. So you'll be able to replay it, share it with other people in your organization, go back and re-listen to a section that you may have wanted, or just skim through it very quickly and pick up bullet points from various slides. So yes, it usually takes us about a day or two to get all the video downloaded, organized, cleaned up, and then sent out, but everybody will get that. All right. The other question we have right now, and again, we invite more to come in. We're going to aim this to you, Rob, because it references your 3 to 5% of revenue, and it's for marketing costs. Is the recommended 3 to 5% of revenue is what's actually spent on just media and advertising, or does it include advertising agency costs, staffing, sales center costs? You know, what all is in that 3 to 5% target that you look for?
The range is 3 to 5%. That 2% there may include in some communities some level of staffing for your sale. It can include your sales team and their compensation package as well. I think, you know, in the bigger picture, it's just important to make sure there is an actual marketing strategy and a campaign. And so that percentage could be 2% and it could work for your community. I think groups like Love and Company can help you determine that and figure out what fits best for your community and your market. You know, we're pretty far removed from the days where your salesperson is also your marketing person, if you will. And I think we've moved past that, and we're strongly into the digital advertising age and having a real strategy to who you are in the market, where you're positioned, and how you're getting that message out there. So it could range.
And the way we think about, you know, marketing budgets is we don't look at it so much from a percentage of revenue basis. Not that there's anything wrong with that. That's a good way to look at it. But we look at it as, what are your goals and what will it take to achieve those goals? In other words, if one community has 20 sales and they have a really strong referral base and wait list, and they're getting 80% of their sales each year from, you know, referrals or the wait list, they're going to need very little marketing to go out and generate the last few sales. If another community has 600 residences, is turning over 90 a year, and is only getting about a third of their sales from, you know, those lower cost referral type leads, they're going to need a really heavy investment. And then we break it down by what proportion of our sales do we expect direct mail to generate? Do we expect a digital marketing to generate? What's a typical cost per lead? What's a typical closing ratio? We put all those things together and say, if your goal is to generate 90 sales or whatever your number is for the year, and this is where your sales are going to come from, then this is what you're going to need to invest in lead generation to achieve those goals. Now, there obviously are other costs beyond just lead generation, but it's a very goal-based approach towards looking at marketing budgets.
Yeah. The other thing to consider is, when was your last substantial investment in like a new website, collateral? If those things are out of date and need to be refreshed, then in the year that they're done, chances are you're going to have a higher percentage of your operating budget in marketing costs for some of those fixed costs that aren't going to need that level of investment year after year.
Good thought. All right, with that, we have reached the end of our question list. Again, I'd like to thank everyone out there for joining us today for this. I hope you got some ideas that you can take back immediately and make an impact on. And Rob Clark would like to thank you again very much for joining us and sharing your time and thoughts with everyone today. And Sarah, I know you're kind of sort of a regular on these with us several times a year. Thanks again for all of your thoughts and insights. And we hope to see most of you. Tell your friends, your coworkers to come back in March and listen to part 2, where we take a look at longer term strategies with Mike Kivoff and Toby Shea of One Point Partners, as well as Sarah and I will be here again. So thank you all very much and take care.